The commercial played on a laptop propped against the kitchen wall. Drake Sorrento walked through a room full of my furniture, my dining table, my cabinets, my Windsor chairs. Design born from passion, he said over the footage. The camera stopped on the armrest. Second spindle from the left. My compass rose, burned into that wood in a Minneapolis basement with an iron I'd carried for 28 years. He broadcast my proof to millions and never thought to look twice. One moment, please subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Your presence here truly matters. My name is Abel Frayne. I'm 55 years old. I teach woodworking and basic cabinetry at South Minneapolis High School for $63,000 a year. 22 years in the same classroom, same 16 workbenches, same wall of student projects I refuse to take down because every kid who builds something with their own hands deserves to see it exist in the world longer than a semester. My father, Emmett Frayne, was a machinist on the iron range outside Duluth. Big hands, quiet voice, the kind of man who could hold a micrometer steady to a 10,000th of an inch. Saturday mornings, he'd bring me to the shop and set me up at the bench with scrap metal and a file. Feel when the grain catches, he'd say, guiding my hand along the stroke. The metal tells you which direction to push. You just have to listen. He died of a heart attack at the kitchen table when I was 17. Sat down with his coffee, reached for the sugar, and was gone before the spoon hit the floor. My mother worked doubles at the hospital to keep us in the house. I had hours of empty evenings that pushed against me from every direction, so I went to the Duluth Public Library and found a book called Tajay Freed Teaches Woodworking. Checked it out 14 times before the librarian told me to just keep it. I bought my first set of chisels at an estate sale for $9, a hand plane for $12, a dovetail saw for $6. The steel was old and good, and I spent 3 evenings sharpening each edge on a whetstone borrowed from the machine shop where my father used to work. By 19, I built a bookshelf from pine board salvaged off a demolition site. It leaned 2 degrees to the left. I shimmed it with a folded playing card and didn't fix it for a year because I wanted to remember what wrong looked like. I married Lorraine when I was 27. She was 25, just finishing a marketing program at the University of Minnesota, working events for a catering company. We met at a friend's wedding reception. She laughed at something I said about the cake table being structurally unsound, and I drove 45 minutes to see her the next night. Every night after that for 3 months. "You're the quietest man I've ever met," she told me on our 4th date, sitting on the hood of my truck outside her apartment in St. Paul. "But when you talk, you actually say something." "That's rare. Might just be saving up my words," I said. "For what? The right person?" She leaned against my shoulder. That was October. We were married by June. We bought the bungalow in the Longfellow neighborhood 6 months after the wedding. 1920s craftsman, 3 bedrooms, original hardwood floors, a covered front porch with columns that needed replacing. Under $200,000. Lorraine liked the kitchen and the south-facing windows. I liked the basement. 900 square feet of unfinished space. Concrete floor, exposed joists, a single bare bulb on a wire. Within a year, I put in proper lighting, laid rubber matting, built a workbench from a reclaimed bowling alley lane, and filled the pegboard walls with hand tools. I found a cast iron lathe at a shop liquidation, broken, half the gearing stripped, rebuilt it over 2 weekends. It was manufactured in 1963 and still turns true. The first piece I built for the house was a set of white oak kitchen cabinets with dovetailed corners. Lorraine came downstairs and watched me fit the first door. She ran her fingers along the joint where 2 pieces of oak interlocked. "Abel, you made this in our basement." 4 months, I said. The oak had to dry another 6 weeks once I got it home. Too much moisture and the joints swell. It's better than anything in a store. A store has a deadline. I don't. She kissed me and stayed a while, her palm flat against the cabinet door. That was the year I still surprised her. The dining table came next. black walnut from a storm-felled tree outside Eau Claire, Wisconsin. I drove 3 hours each way with a rented trailer to pick up the slabs, stacked them in the basement with spacers between each board, and waited 2 years before I touched them. Wood needs time. You can kiln dry a board in days, but air drying lets the internal tension release at its own pace. Rush it, and it warps on the bench. That table seats 8. Hand-cut mortise-and-tenon joints, no screws, no metal fasteners. A breadboard end on each side to keep the top flat across seasonal humidity changes. 7 coats of hand-rubbed tung oil, sanding between each coat with 600 grit until the surface felt like river stone under my fingers. After the table, I couldn't stop. Windsor chairs took 6 weeks each, steam-bent ash spindles, sculpted butternut seats, hand-turned legs on the rebuilt lathe. A cherry mantel clock with a hand-carved bezel. A spalted maple credenza, bed frames, side tables. For our 10th anniversary, I built a blanket chest in figured maple. Lorraine lifted the lid the morning I gave it to her and held it there, looking at the grain inside where it curled like smoke. She kept her mother's quilts in it from that day on. My son Bryce used to follow me down to the workshop when he was small, 4 years old, and he'd sit on an upturned bucket near the bench while I worked, breathing in sawdust and linseed oil like it was the most normal air in the world. "What's that one?" he'd ask, pointing at a board. "Cherry. Smell it." He'd press his nose against the grain and close his eyes. "Smells different than the other one. That other one's maple. Each wood carries its own scent. You'll learn them all." When he was 7, I built him a writing desk scaled to his height with a slide-out shelf that could grow with him. He sat on the bucket and sanded the drawer front with 220 grit while I shaped the legs. 2 of us in that basement, working side by side, not needing to fill the air with anything but the sound of hands on wood. Over 28 years, I built more than 40 pieces. Every room in the house held something I'd made. The lumber came from suppliers across the upper Midwest, white oak from a barn demolition in Red Wing, spalted maple from a dealer in Ashland, cherry from a sawmill outside Hayward. I kept every receipt in a manila folder in my workshop filing cabinet. Dates, species, quantities, costs. Some of those receipts are older than Drake Sorrento's entire design career. When I was 27, the spring before I married Lorraine, I drove to Duluth and found a blacksmith named Erno Maki working out of a corrugated steel shop on a back road near the harbor. Old Finnish man, leather apron, a forge he'd built from a repurposed oil drum. I showed him my sketch. Compass rose, 4 points, my initials in the center, size of a quarter. "Branding iron," he said. "Not a question. For signing my work." He held the sketch up to the light from the doorway. "Every piece? Every one." He studied me the way my father used to, measuring something that didn't show on the surface. Then he turned to the forge without another word. I paid him $75 I didn't have. That compass rose went into every piece I built from that day on. Not where anyone would see it. Under chair armrests. Inside drawer bottoms. Beneath table aprons. Behind cabinet backs. You'd have to know to look, and you'd have to flip the piece over or pull a drawer out to find it. The mark wasn't for anyone else. It was between me and the wood. My way of saying, I know where you came from, and I know who made you. In 1998, I started keeping a leather-bound craft journal. Hand-stitched binding, unlined pages. Every piece I planned, I sketched first. Front elevation, side view, joinery details, wood species, dimensions. I taped in photographs of finished work. Polaroids in the early years, printed digital images later, each entry dated. The margins filled with small ink drawings of birds I spotted from the workshop window. A chickadee nesting under the eaves. A Cooper's hawk working the alley. A pileated woodpecker that visited the dying elm 2 houses down for 3 consecutive springs. I can identify over 200 North American species by outline alone. Never mention that to anyone. Some things are just yours. I never sold a single piece. The dining table was for the meals my family ate. The cabinets held dishes Lorraine inherited from her mother. The Windsor chairs were for Thanksgivings, for guests, for the evenings when we sat across from each other and talked about our days, back when she still asked about mine. 2 years ago, I walked through the American Craft Council show in St. Paul. A Windsor chair with machine-assisted joints had a card next to it, $4,000. A walnut dining table, smaller than mine, listed at 18. I stood in front of that table and did the math on 43 pieces back in my basement. The number came back above 300,000. I know artisan prices the way a man who builds boats knows the tide charts, not because he plans to sell the harbor. Lorraine used to bring coffee to the basement and sit on the bottom step, asking questions about the wood. What kind is that? Why does this one have stripes? How long does the glue take? I answered everyone, and she listened, and the workshop felt like a room we shared. I can't pin the year that stopped. Things like that don't snap. They wear, the way a hinge goes stiff season by season until one morning the door won't swing and you realize it hasn't for a while. Coffee stopped. Questions stopped. Her footsteps on the stairs stopped. At dinner parties, when someone asked what her husband did, Lorraine would answer the same way every time. He teaches high school, she'd say. Then a pause. Then a smile that went tight at the corners, holding something back behind the teeth. I knew that expression the way I knew a board with hidden stress, straight on the surface, wrong underneath. One December, she left a printout on my workbench. A custom furniture business in Stillwater, listed for sale. Existing client list, retail space, projected margins. I found it the next morning under my hand plane, read it through, folded it, and filed it in the cabinet next to the lumber receipts. She never mentioned it again. Neither did I. Bryce stopped coming to the workshop around 13. The boy who used to press his nose against cherry boards and breathe deep grew into a teenager who flinched at the sound of the planer on Saturday mornings. He stopped asking what I was building, stopped remembering the difference between maple and walnut. The desk I'd built him collected textbooks and phone chargers, and he never once turned it over to see what was on the underside. 43 pieces, 28 years, everyone signed, documented, photographed, and dated. I can trace which tree became which table, which supplier sold which board, which year I sketched each design, and which week I rubbed on the final coat. Nobody in my house ever asked to see the journal. Nobody flipped a chair to check what was underneath. The compass rose stayed hidden in wood that other hands touched every day without knowing what they held. Lorraine's college friend Karen Henderson married a vascular surgeon named Dave Pryor. Their house in Edina had a kitchen island that cost more than my annual salary. Every July, Karen hosted a garden party. 60 guests, a bartender in a bow tie, catered food on long tables under a rented tent. I went because Lorraine wanted me there. Clean shirt, pressed khakis. I stood near the food and talked to whoever stopped by. Greg Walsh, VP at Target Corporate, Mark Siegel, partner at a downtown law firm, men who sized each other up by salary band and square footage. What do you do, Abel? I teach shop, high school. A nod. A slight adjustment in posture. Not hostile, just a reclassification. I moved from equal to afterthought in the time it took the word shop to register. I didn't mind. I'd never needed these men to think I was one of them. But Lorraine did. She watched these exchanges from across the yard. I could track her attention the way you track a crack forming in a board under clamp pressure. Slow, running in one direction, not stopping. On the drive home from the Hendersons' 4th of July party, she didn't speak until we hit the highway. Karen's remodeling their master bath, Italian tile. Dave's taking her to Positano in September. That sounds nice. She adjusted the air vent on her side, pointed it away from her face. Dave makes $400,000 a year. I kept my eyes on the road. Lorraine watched Edina disappear in the side mirror. I'm not asking you to be Dave, she said. I'm asking you to want more. I want what I have. That's the problem, Abel. We had that conversation, or some version of it, every few months. Different names, different numbers. Same destination. The parties continued. Karen's, the Seagulls, New Year's at Greg Walsh's lake house in Minnetonka. Lorraine arrived at each one dressed sharper, laughed louder at other men's stories. I watched her work a room like someone auditioning for a part she hadn't been cast in yet. When someone asked about me, she had her line. I could hear it from across the yard, the words carrying farther than she realized. Same introduction every time. Same pause after. Same smile that held at the mouth and stopped there. I found her Pinterest board by accident. A Saturday afternoon, Lorraine at yoga, her laptop open on the kitchen table. She'd asked me to look up a recipe she'd bookmarked. I opened the browser and her account was still logged in, the screen filled with a board she'd titled The Life. 4,000 pins. 9 years of collecting. I scrolled. Penthouse apartments with floor-to-ceiling windows. Kitchen renovations that cost 6 figures. Closets arranged like display cases. Handbags on lit shelves. Shoes sorted by color. Vacation homes on coastlines I'd never visited. Designer furniture in rooms the size of our entire first floor. I recognized Karen Henderson's redesigned sunroom, pinned twice. A kitchen from a magazine spread. White marble, pendant lights, the kind of space that announces its own cost. Lorraine had annotated one pin with a single word someday. 9 years. She'd been building a different life on a screen, one pin at a time, while I built furniture in the basement below her feet. I closed the browser, found the recipe, and wrote it on a note card. I sat with the card in my hand, the kitchen quiet around me, until I heard Lorraine's key in the front door. Found it, I said. Thanks. She took the card without looking at me and went upstairs to shower. I sat at the dining table. My dining table, black walnut, hand-cut joints, 7 coats of tongue oil, and thought about 4,000 images of the life she wanted, and not one of them showing anything I'd made. Bryce graduated from the University of Minnesota with a communications degree in 2022. By then, the boy who used to sit on a bucket in my workshop and press his nose against cherry boards had become someone I caught only in traces, the jawline, the tilt of his head when listening. Everything else belonged to a person I hadn't raised. After graduation, he bounced between freelance gigs, wedding videos, real estate walkthroughs, promotional clips for restaurants that closed within the year. Between jobs, he worked the counter at a coffee shop in Uptown. His phone never left his hand, filming, editing, posting. Thanksgiving, 2023. Lorraine's sister and her family drove up from Rochester. 12 of us around the dining table. Turkey on serving plates that sat on a surface I'd sanded to river stone, each cut of grain running unbroken end to end. After dinner, Lorraine's brother-in-law Jeff pointed at the maple side table near the front door. Figured, with a floating shelf. Abel made that, Lorraine said. Flat. A weather report. You should sell these, Jeff said. People pay a fortune for this kind of work. Bryce leaned against the kitchen door frame, filming the table scraps for some clip I'd never see. He looked up from his phone. It's a hobby, not art, Dad. There's a difference. The table held 12 settings, and the weight of that sentence without bowing. I picked up my plate, carried it to the kitchen, and washed it by hand. By 25, Bryce had 40,000 Instagram followers. His feed ran in 10-second clips, meals at restaurants he couldn't afford, rooftop views of the Minneapolis skyline, behind-the-scenes shots of whatever project he'd attached himself to that month. I scrolled through them one evening at the workbench, the screen casting blue light across a half-finished drawer. 40,000 people watched my son's life in 10-second windows. 3 years of posts. Not a single image of the workshop. Not one photograph of a chair, a cabinet, a joint. As if the basement didn't exist. Drake Sorrento entered through Karen Henderson's living room. Karen hired him for a full redesign. 3 rooms, 6-figure budget, the kind of project that ends up in a magazine. Drake had a streaming show called Sorrento Living that averaged over 1 million viewers per episode. 2 industry awards. A Soho studio in Manhattan. A face built for camera. Tall, tanned, year-round, slim blazers over black t-shirts, Italian sneakers that had never touched sawdust. Lorraine came home from Karen's reveal party and stood in our kitchen talking for 20 minutes without sitting down. He walks into a room and sees what it should be. He pointed at Karen's fireplace and said the whole space was organized wrong. And then he fixed it. Karen was in tears. I was eating leftover soup at the dining table. He keeps his tools in a glass case, she said. Vintage chisels, $12,000. I looked up. Does he use them? They're collector's items. So, no. She stared at me. The look lasted 3 seconds, and I felt every one of them. You don't understand what he does, she said. He decorates rooms. He creates experiences. I finished my soup and rinsed the bowl. Lorraine went upstairs. Neither of us said anything else that night. Drake came to our house for dinner 2 weeks later. Lorraine invited him. She spent 3 days cleaning rooms that were already clean, rearranging objects on shelves, buying new candles. She ordered from the Italian place on Lake Street. He walked in wearing charcoal linen. Handshake firm, eye contact rehearsed. Beautiful home, he said, scanning the entryway. His eyes stopped on the maple side table. Moved to the coat rack I'd built from reclaimed barnwood. Traveled through the living room, pausing on the Windsor chair's armrest, the mantel clock's bezel. He didn't look at the furniture the way most guests did. His hand moved differently. He pressed into the grain, tested the heft of a drawer pull. His ring clicked against the wood when he crouched to examine the dovetail joint on the credenza, fingers tracing the fit between pins and tails. His jaw tightened a fraction, the smallest reaction, gone before most people would catch it. But I'd spent my life reading surfaces, and that twitch told me everything. He recognized what he was touching. Who made these? He asked. Abel, Lorraine said from the kitchen doorway. He makes them in the basement. Drake looked at me. Something behind his eyes reorganized. Not admiration, appraisal. The look of a man pricing stock he hadn't expected to find. You're very talented, he said. I've had time to practice. This joinery, he tapped the credenza's corner. This isn't practice. This is something else. He said it the way a man compliments a house he's planning to buy. Over dinner, he talked about Manhattan gallery connections and his upcoming furniture line. Milan was standing room only last spring, he said. 300 designers in a warehouse. Electric. Lorraine sat forward in her Windsor chair, my Windsor chair hanging on each word. He mentioned first-class flights to design shows, dropped names of architects and magazine editors, described his Soho studio as if the address alone were worth the flight. You should come see it, he told Lorraine. I'd love your eye on some staging. She smiled. Not the tight smile from the parties. A different one, open, alive with a heat I hadn't seen aimed at me in years. She hadn't looked at me once during the meal, not when she passed the bread, not when she laughed at his stories, not when she refilled his wine. I sat at the head of a table I'd built with my own hands and watched a man who kept tools in a glass case charm my wife over food she'd ordered from the Italian place on Lake Street. After he left, Lorraine cleared the dishes without a word. I went downstairs and stood in the workshop. The lathe, the pegboard, the stacked lumber. Everything where it belonged. Everything the same as it had been for decades. But something had entered the house that night and taken its own measurement. Within a month, Lorraine was flying to Manhattan. First class, Drake's booking. Gallery openings. Dinners at restaurants where the tasting menu cost $300 a person. She came home with stories about producers, designers, magazine editors, and a life in her face I hadn't put there. I didn't ask where she went or who she sat with. The answers came in her voice anyway, the way she said Drake's name with a softness she hadn't used for mine in a decade. This is what I was supposed to be doing, she said once, unpacking a carry-on in the bedroom. This is the life I was supposed to have. I was reading in bed. I set my book on the nightstand. Butternut hand-carved pulls, compass rose burned into the back panel. and turned off the light. Bryce called less. Once a week became twice a month, became a text here and there, short, always about his projects, never asking about mine. When I phoned him, the line rang through to voicemail. I stopped leaving messages after the third one went unanswered. Every room held something I'd made. Every surface carried a mark no one checked for. And each evening, I sat among my own work, in rooms full of wood that knew my hands, surrounded by a silence I hadn't built and couldn't sand down or plane away or fix with any tool I owned. Lorraine filed on a Tuesday in March. I came home from school and found the envelope on the dining table. My dining table, black walnut, hand-cut joints, propped against a coffee mug she'd left behind. No note. The mug was empty. The house was emptier. She'd moved to a furnished apartment in Uptown the previous weekend while I was at a woodworking show in Eau Claire. Took her clothes, her mother's china from the white oak cabinets, and the quilts from the blanket chest I'd built for our 10th anniversary. Left everything else. The house looked the same as it always had, minus her. I read the petition 3 times at the kitchen counter. Irreconcilable differences. Standard language. The papers didn't mention Drake's name, didn't need to. His name had been written across the previous 6 months in first-class boarding passes and restaurant charges and weeknight absences that Lorraine stopped bothering to explain. I should have fought. Hired the best family law attorney in Hennepin County, demanded an independent appraisal of every piece of furniture in the house, forced someone, a judge, a mediator, anyone, to look at what I'd built and tell me what it was worth. But I wasn't thinking in those terms. I was thinking about the bottom step where Lorraine used to sit with her coffee, asking about the wood, about Bryce at 4 years old, pressing his nose against cherry boards. About 28 years compressing into a single brown envelope on a table I'd sanded to river stone. I asked around for a divorce attorney and took the first name that came back twice. Tom Phelps, general practice, 2-man office on Nicollet Avenue. Divorces, real estate closings, traffic disputes, fender benders. He had gray suits and a kind voice and a caseload of 47 active files the month I walked in. I need a divorce attorney, I said. I can handle that. What are we looking at? I told him about the house, the furniture, the 22 years of teaching. He wrote it down on a yellow legal pad. He didn't ask about the furniture beyond what I volunteered, and I didn't volunteer much. I was 54 years old and too hollowed out to inventory my own life's work for a stranger with a legal pad. Lorraine hired Deborah Keene, family law specialist at a firm downtown, the kind of attorney who billed $400 an hour and kept a wall of grateful client testimonials in the lobby. Keene had handled divorces for 2 state legislators and a Twin Cities news anchor. She could strip a marriage down to its joints and pull them apart in 30 days. Phelps didn't stand a chance. The settlement negotiation lasted 3 weeks. In Minnesota, marital property gets divided by the court if the parties can't agree. Keene's team submitted an asset declaration listing the house at its assessed value, our retirement accounts, the cars, and a line item near the bottom of page 4. Household furnishings and personal property, $12,000. $12,000. What you'd spend at a furniture chain for a living room set. A couch, a coffee table, a bookshelf made of particle board and held together with dowels and hope. Phelps reviewed it and nodded. That's standard, he said. Household goods rarely come to much in these settlements. Those aren't household goods. I built every piece in that house. I understand, but the court sees furniture as furniture. Used furniture depreciates. $12,000 is reasonable for a 3-bedroom home's worth of items. I should have pulled the craft journal from my truck and opened it to any page. The walnut dining table, the Windsor chairs, the spalted maple credenza, and asked him to look at what $12,000 was supposed to cover. Should have told him that a single Windsor chair by a recognized maker sells for $4,000 to $8,000 at auction. That the dining table alone, hand-cut mortise-and-tenon joints in black walnut, was worth $15,000 to $20,000. I signed the papers. Lorraine got the house and everything in it. I kept my pension, my truck, and whatever I could carry. What I didn't learn until much later, not until someone pulled the records months after the divorce was final, was what had already been set in motion 4 months before the ink dried. Bryce had signed a 12-page production contract with Sorrento Media, LLC, associate producer on Sorrento Living. $52,000 a year plus performance bonuses. His name on the credits, a title, a salary, and the break he'd been chasing since graduation. Page 9 of the appendix held a clause. It granted Sorrento Media access to and use of all furnishings, decor, and material assets made available through the Frayne household. My son signed away my life's work in an appendix clause. Whether he read it or chose not to, the result was the same. The furniture was spoken for before the marriage was over. The divorce wasn't a rupture. It was a closing transaction. 3 weeks after the settlement, a moving truck pulled into the driveway of the Longfellow bungalow. Drake sent a professional crew, 4 men in gray uniforms with furniture blankets, hand trucks, and packing tape. They worked room by room. The dining table went first, carried horizontal through the front door by 2 men who didn't know they were holding 2 years of air-dried black walnut and 7 coats of hand-rubbed tongue oil. Then, the Windsor chairs, the cabinets, the credenza, the bed frames, the side tables, the mantel clock, the blanket chest, 43 pieces, wrapped, loaded, secured. A truck's worth of work that had taken 28 years to build, packed in under 4 hours. They drove east to Manhattan, to Drake's Soho studio with polished concrete floors and the glass case of vintage chisels he'd never touched. My dining table became his consultation surface on camera. My Windsor chairs were arranged around it for the show. Drake mounted a brass placard on each piece's base. Original design by Drake Sorrento. Bryce called 2 weeks after the movers came. I picked up on the second ring. His name on the screen still did that to me. Dad, I know this is hard, but I think you're making it bigger than it needs to be. Making what bigger? The furniture stuff. Mom said you're upset about the settlement. I stood in the kitchen of the Longfellow bungalow. Empty now. The walls where the white oak cabinets had hung showed rectangles of paint, a shade darker than the surrounding surface, ghost outlines of 20-year-old woodwork. It's furniture, Dad. Wood and nails. You can make more. Wood and nails. 28 years. 43 pieces. Every joint hand-cut. Every surface hand-finished. Every hidden mark placed with a branding iron I'd carried since I was 27. Wood and nails. Bryce. Who hired the movers? Silence on the line. The kind that sits the way green wood sits. Tension in it, waiting to move. Drake needed the pieces for the show, he said. It's good exposure. People are going to see your work. With his name on it. It's a collaboration. Did you read the contract? Another silence. Longer. I gotta go, Dad. I'm on set. He hung up. I set the phone on the bare kitchen counter and stood in the house I'd filled with 28 years of work. The dark rectangles on the walls. The screw holes in the floor where the credenza's leveling feet had sat. Dents in the hardwood from chair legs that had held Thanksgivings, birthdays, ordinary Tuesdays. Every absence the exact shape of something I'd made. I packed my truck the next morning. Not the furniture, that was gone. But the things no one had thought to take. The hand tools came off the pegboard first. Chisels, hand planes, dovetail saws, the marking gauge my father used to own, each one wrapped in a shop rag and laid in a pine tool chest I'd built 20 years before. The leather-bound craft journal went in next. Every sketch, every photograph, every dated entry since 1998. The manila folder of lumber receipts, some yellowed and soft at the folds, from suppliers in Eau Claire, Red Wing, Ashland, Hayward, and the compass rose branding iron, cold in my hand, heavy for its size, the 4 points and center monogram worn smooth from nearly 3 decades of use. I ran my thumb across the face and felt my own initials pressed into the steel like a name pressed into wood. 4 trips to the truck. I locked the front door and left the key under the mat. The drive from Minneapolis to Brattleboro, Vermont, took 19 hours. I stopped twice for gas and once for coffee at a truck stop in Erie, Pennsylvania, where a waitress asked if I was moving. Starting over, I said. The cabin sat on 12 wooded acres outside town. The property belonged to a retired math teacher named Howard Marsh, who wintered in Sarasota and rented the place cheap in exchange for maintenance. 1 bedroom, a kitchen that smelled like propane and pine, a bathroom with a fiberglass shower stall, no television. I didn't want one. I spent the first week converting the 2-car garage. Hauled in a used bandsaw from a shop closing in Keene, New Hampshire, hung my hand tools on a pegboard wall I built from pine studs and 1/4-inch board, same layout as the Minneapolis basement, muscle memory placing each tool in its spot. Built a workbench from a white ash slab I found at a mill in Putney, 2 inches thick, heavy enough to absorb a mallet strike without shifting. The Vermont hardwood was good, sugar maple, butternut, white ash. I started working within the week. Not commissions, not furniture for anyone, just wood and hands and the sound of a plane pulling a curl off a board, thin as paper, holding light. On a November evening, I sat in the cabin kitchen with a glass of water and the craft journal open to a random page. The Windsor chair sketch, dated 2019, ash spindles, butternut seat, hand-turned legs, margin notes about steam-bending temperatures, and the grain direction of the crest rail. A small ink drawing of a nuthatch in the lower corner. I closed the journal and set my palm flat on the table. A rental table, someone else's work, the grain running against itself. Somewhere in a Manhattan studio, my compass rose sat hidden on 43 pieces of furniture, each one wearing another man's name on a brass placard. The marks were in the wood. You can sand a surface, refinish it, stain over it. A brand goes deeper than any of that. I said nothing to anyone. The marks could wait. They'd been waiting 28 years already. I built, through the fall, a blanket chest in butternut from the Putney Mill, a step stool from sugar maple, bookends in white ash, the grain running vertical, tight and clean. Vermont wood taught different lessons than what I'd worked in Minneapolis. Sugar maple fought the plane, pushed back at every stroke. Butternut bruised under too much clamp pressure. White ash split clean along the grain, but punished a crosscut. I learned each species the way I'd learned the Midwest hardwoods decades ago, by ruining material until my hands figured out what the books couldn't teach. I talked to Howard Marsh once a month about property maintenance, replaced roof flashing in October, stacked firewood, shoveled the driveway when the snow came. Beyond that, I spoke to no one. One evening in late November, I propped the laptop against the kitchen wall to check email. The school district benefits office had sent a pension rollover form. I opened the browser and a video ad loaded above my inbox. Autoplay. Drake's face filled the screen, his voice tinny through the laptop speakers. He walked through a room I'd never seen. High ceilings, natural light, a camera tracking him from behind as he ran his hand along a surface, my surface. The black walnut dining table, positioned in front of windows that weren't mine, styled with ceramic plates and linen napkins I'd never chosen. Design born from passion, Drake said over the footage. The camera cut to my white oak cabinets, doors open, shelved with objects arranged by color. Cut to the spalted maple credenza against exposed brick. Cut to the bed frame dressed in white sheets, morning light staged through gauze curtains. Drake talked about vision and legacy and the soul of American design, words lifted from conversations at my dining table and polished for broadcast. Then, the Windsor chair. The shot held. The camera stopped on the armrest. 3 seconds. Second spindle from the left. Something caught the studio light, a shape in the surface that didn't belong to the grain. I set my coffee down, rewound the ad, hit pause. My compass rose sat in the lower curve of the armrest, half shadowed by the spindle above it. 4 points, center monogram, burned into that wood in my Minneapolis basement in 2019. Drake's production team had filmed my maker's mark in high definition and broadcast it without once checking what they were airing. I played it a third time. sane frame. The mark was not ambiguous, not a blemish, not a shadow. A brand, sharp-edged, placed with intent, visible to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Drake put my chair on a national commercial and never thought to flip it over. I closed the laptop. The baseboard heater ticked. The bare trees moved outside the window. I sat at the counter with my hands flat on the surface until the coffee went cold. Then, I carried the laptop to the workshop. The craft journal sat on the shelf above the workbench. I opened it to June 2019. The Windsor chair, 2 pages of sketches, front elevation, side profile, detail drawing of the Steenbent crest rail, notes about the butternut seat and ash spindles. A photograph taped to the facing page showed the finished chair on my Minneapolis porch. August 14, 2019. I turned back through the years. The dining table, sketched in 2003. The cabinets, designed and built in 2001. The credenza, 2012. Each page dated. Each design drawn before it existed in wood. Before Drake had a show, a studio, or a name, anyone outside a decorator's contact list would recognize. The manila folder came out of the filing cabinet next. I spread the receipts across the workbench. Hendrickson's Hardwood in Eau Claire Black Walnut, November 2001. The Red Wing Barn Demolition, White Oak, March 2000. Ashland Wood Supply, Spalted Maple, 2011. Yellowed Paper, Fading Ink, dates that preceded Drake's design career by 10 years or more. The next morning, I bought a digital camera at the Brattleboro hardware store. Point and shoot, 12 megapixels, macro setting. Back at the bench, I photographed every journal page, every receipt, every completion photograph. Multiple angles on the sketches, close-ups of the dates, wide shots of the receipts spread across the workbench in chronological stacks, oldest to newest, the early ink already fading. I organized them on the laptop. 1 folder per piece, 43 folders, each containing the full creation chain from sketch to finished work. 4 days. Mornings in the garage building a nightstand from cherry. Afternoons at the workbench cataloging evidence. Same process I'd always followed. Different product. On the 5th day, I logged into the Upper Midwest Woodworkers Guild Forum, 5,000 members, posts going back to 2006, and sent a private message to Dale Hendrickson, who'd taken over his father's lumberyard in Eau Claire. Dale, I need a favor. Can you pull your records for a black walnut purchase, November 2001, customer name Frayne? His reply came the next morning. Got the original invoice, Abel, carbon copy with your signature on it. What's going on? Someone's claiming my furniture as his own design. I need the paper trail. Sending it now. The scanned invoice arrived within the hour. I contacted 3 more suppliers through the forum. Red Wing, Ashland, Hayward. Each one remembered me. A man who drives 3 hours to hand-select boards and asks about growth conditions and drying time leaves an impression that outlasts the sale. Through the guild board, a member forwarded my situation to a woman named Phoebe Langdon, a 38-year-old investigative journalist who covered the design industry for a New York architecture magazine. 2 years earlier, she'd published a piece exposing a countertop manufacturer passing off domestic granite as Italian marble. 7 months of supplier tracking and material analysis. The company folded within a year. Her email arrived on a Tuesday. Mr. Frayne, I'm told you have an attribution claim against Drake Sorrento. I should be direct. People accuse successful designers of copying all the time. I don't pursue stories based on resentment. I pursue them based on documented proof. Do you have any? I replied with 2 images side by side. My journal page for the Windsor chair, dated June 2019. A screenshot of Drake's commercial paused on the compass rose. She drove to Brattleboro that Saturday. Phoebe stood at my door in a gray wool coat and worn boots, a leather messenger bag over one shoulder, sharp features, dark hair cut above the collar, the posture of someone who could spend 8 hours in a hard chair and never shift. She shook my hand and looked past me into the cabin, not pricing what she saw, the way Drake had done in my Minneapolis living room. reading the space the way I read grain. "Show me everything," she said. I spread the journal on the kitchen table. She sat, took a notebook from her bag, and opened to page 1, 1998, the first entry, a pine bookshelf, dimensions, grain direction notes. Her fingers stopped under the date. "Is this the original binding?" she asked. "Hand-stitched. Same journal since '98. She turned pages without rushing. Dovetail sketches, sawmill photographs, a margin drawing of a red-tailed hawk. "You draw birds," she said, not looking up, from the workshop window. "Freehand. I can name the species, the date, and what I was building when I drew each one." She worked through the journal for 6 hours. I made coffee twice. She drank without lifting her attention from the pages, her focus locked on the intersection of dates, designs, and materials. Every 20 minutes she stopped, opened the screenshots of Drake's commercial on her own laptop, and matched a piece visible in the footage against my sketch. Dimensions aligned, joinery matched. The wood species I'd noted in entries from 2001, 2003, 2012 appeared in the commercial's high-definition shots of the same furniture wearing brass placards that read "Original Design by Drake Sorrento." By 4 o'clock, the light through the kitchen window had gone amber. Phoebe set her pen down and pressed both palms flat against the table. "This is a documented creation chain spanning 28 years, she said. "Sketch to sourcing to finished work. Dated, photographed, and signed. Yes." And the compass rose. "You're telling me every piece Drake is displaying carries your maker's mark in a hidden location, under armrests, inside drawer bottoms, behind cabinet backs. I can tell you the exact position on each one." She picked up her phone. "Drake's Manhattan launch gala is in 3 weeks. I have press credentials for the morning preview. Press gets in before the event, 10 a.m. The gala opens to guests at 7 that evening." She closed her notebook and stood. "I need copies of every file. Journal, receipts, supplier confirmations." I slid a USB drive across the table. 412 files, organized by piece. She dropped it into her coat pocket. "If I find those marks where you say they are, this is the biggest design fraud story in a decade. They're there. I'll know in 3 weeks." 3 weeks later, Phoebe called from her apartment in Brooklyn. I picked up on the first ring. 12 pieces examined, she said. 12 marks found. Dining table apron on the left side. Credenza bottom drawer rear panel. Cabinet backing. Upper left corner. Every location matches your journal to the inch. The Windsor chair. Second spindle from the left. Your compass rose, clear as a photograph. I shot it from 3 angles. Paper shifted on her end. She was already writing. 7,000 words, she said. Side-by-side photographs. Your journal sketches next to his claimed designs. Supplier confirmations with dates. The compass rose documented on 12 separate pieces. I'm calling it the craftsman's ghost. When does it go out? The gala is Saturday evening. I publish at 6 a.m. Saturday morning. By the time his 300 guests sit down at those tables, your tables, every design journalist, sponsor, and buyer in the industry will have read it. After she hung up, I set the phone on the kitchen counter next to the laptop where I'd watched that commercial 3 weeks earlier. The craft journal sat beside it, the manila folder of receipts, the branding iron on the shelf above the workbench, 4 compass points worn smooth from 28 years of use. 6 months ago, I'd packed those things into a truck because no one else thought they were worth taking. Phoebe called Friday afternoon. I need you in the city tomorrow. I want you in that room when it hits. I drove south that evening. 3.5 hours to Manhattan. Checked into a motel off the turnpike in Jersey. $40 a night. Highway noise through thin walls. I lay on the bed with the lights off and thought about 43 pieces of my furniture somewhere across the river, each one wearing a brass placard with another man's name. The article posted at 6 the next morning. Phoebe's text came at 5,058. It's up. I opened the link on my laptop. The Craftsman's Ghost. 7,000 words. The lead image was a split frame. My journal sketch of the Windsor chair, dated June 2019, next to Drake's commercial still of the same chair beneath its placard. Below that, a close-up of the compass rose on the armrest. Second spindle from the left. My initials at center, clear as a signature on a contract. Phoebe built the piece the way I'd build a cabinet. Foundation first, then the face. The marks. The documentation chain. The supplier invoices. Then, the production contract, Bryce's name on page 9, the appendix clause granting Sorrento Media access to all furnishings made available through the Frayne household, signed 4 months before the divorce was final. By noon, her editor called it the most shared article in the magazine's history. Design blogs ran it first, then the trade outlets, then national press. I turned my phone face down on the motel nightstand and watched light move across the ceiling until it was time to go. Phoebe had arranged press credentials for me. Photographer. She met me outside the warehouse at 6:30, 30 minutes before doors opened. The building was industrial brick, 4 stories, the loading dock converted to a grand entrance. The Sorrento collection in gold lettering on a black banner. 2 security guards at the doors. A woman with a clipboard checked our badges and waved us through. Inside, I stopped walking. My dining table sat on a raised platform at the center of the floor. Black walnut, hand-cut joints, 7 coats of tung oil. The grain ran unbroken end to end under ceramic plates and linen napkins I'd never chosen. A brass placard at the base read "Original Design by Drake Sorrento, $28,000. Beyond the table, my white oak cabinets against exposed brick, doors open, styled with objects sorted by color. The spalted maple credenza, the bed frame stripped bare, displayed as sculpture on a low riser. Windsor chairs arranged around smaller tables across the floor. 32 pieces on the floor, each tagged and priced. 5-figure numbers on cards next to wood I'd shaped in a Minneapolis basement. The other 11 at the studio or in storage. I didn't know and didn't need to. Pre-orders for the collection had already passed. $1 million. I walked the room with a camera around my neck I never raised. Phoebe stayed beside me, saying nothing. "You all right?" she asked after the second lap. "I built every piece in this room. I'm fine." Guests arrived at 7. 300 people in evening wear. Cocktails on silver trays. A string quartet in the corner, the cello low enough to feel in the floorboards. Drake came in at 7:15. Black shirt, charcoal suit, collar open. He walked to the head table, my dining table, and stood behind the chair at its end, one hand flat on the walnut surface. Cameras flashed. He smiled the way a man smiles when he believes the room belongs to him. Lorraine sat at his right. Dark dress, hair pulled back. From 40 feet, I could see the held quality of her expression. The one I'd watched for 15 years at other people's parties. The fixed mouth, the eyes performing something the rest of her face didn't believe. By 7:30, conversations shortened. Eyes dropped to phone screens. I watched it move through the crowd in clusters. A table of 4 going quiet, then the table beside them, then the next. A woman in a green dress stopped mid-sentence, stared at her phone, and looked at the Windsor chair next to her table. She crouched down. Her fingers went under the armrest. "There's something here," she said to the man beside her. She turned the chair over. The compass rose sat in the wood. 4 points, center monogram, sharp-edged from the branding iron I'd heated in a Minneapolis basement 5 years ago. She held her phone next to the mark, Phoebe's photograph on the screen, the brand in the grain. Same size, same shape, same initials. It moved through the room table by table. 2 men at a side table pulling a drawer from the credenza. A woman in a red coat checking the underside of a cabinet shelf. 3 guests flipping a Windsor chair while a waiter stood holding their abandoned drinks. Each time, the compass rose. Each time, the match. A journalist from a New York design publication walked up to Drake at the head table with her phone extended, the article filling the screen. Mr. Sorrento, there are maker's marks on every piece in this room. Can you explain them? Drake's hand was still on the dining table. He didn't move it. I don't respond to anonymous accusations from design school dropouts with a grudge, he said. The accusations aren't anonymous, the journalist said. The maker is named. The documentation goes back 28 years. I'll be speaking with my legal team, and I'd suggest the author of that piece talk to hers about defamation law. He turned his back. The room had already turned with him. A second journalist came from the other side, a man with a press badge and a recorder. Drake, your sponsors are asking questions about the compass rose. Are these marks original to the furniture? His jaw worked. The camera-ready voice was gone. What came out sounded like a script someone had torn in half and tried to reassemble. These pieces there's been a collaborative. The creative direction has always involved multiple sources of inspiration, and any suggestion that he stopped, tried again, stopped. No further questions tonight. I watched from the press section near the wall. 300 people on their feet, moving between tables, checking wood, holding phones against surfaces. The string quartet kept playing to a room that had stopped listening. Every few minutes another guest found another mark and held it up for the people beside them. The article's photographs matched the brands in the wood. 28 years of marks placed by the same hand, found in the exact locations I'd recorded in a leather-bound journal sitting on a shelf in a Vermont workshop 200 miles north. Lorraine hadn't moved from her chair. Drake stood 2 feet away with both hands flat on my walnut table, staring past the caterers at something that wasn't there. No Italian phrases, no practiced lines about vision and the soul of American design. His face carried the look of a man who'd reached for a tool and found nothing in his hand. My son stood near the production area along the back wall, phone raised, camera running. His face was blank. He panned the room in a slow sweep. Guests with overturned chairs. Drake's silence. Lorraine's stillness. The camera running the way it always did. 40,000 followers, and this was the footage he'd never post. I left through the loading dock at 9. The dock door was industrial steel, heavy on its track, and the sound of the gala cut to nothing the moment it shut behind me. November air hit my face, cold enough to feel in my teeth. The sounds of 300 people and a string quartet reduced to a low hum through warehouse brick. Phoebe came out 10 minutes later, coat buttoned, notebook in her hand. Both sponsors pulled out, she said. Viridian Home and Kessler brands. Their representatives walked out during the Compass Rose discovery. $1 million in sponsorship, gone before the dessert course. The pre-orders. Every buyer I talk to is canceling. The collection is finished. She dropped the notebook into her bag. Go home, Abel, get some rest. This moves fast from here. I drove back to Jersey. Sat in the motel parking lot with the engine off and the windows cracked. The phone vibrated in my coat pocket. I let it ring through. It rang again. Vermont area code. Number I didn't recognize. Mr. Frayne, my name is Ruth Okada. I'm an intellectual property attorney in Burlington. My father built furniture in Tillamook, Oregon for 30 years. Chairs and tables, a one-man shop on a rural highway. How did you get this number? Phoebe, Langdon. I read the article at 6 this morning and reviewed every sourced document. Then, I read it again. A truck pulled through the parking lot, headlights crossing my windshield and moving on. What was done to you is fraud and intellectual property theft, she said. The production contract, the divorce settlement, the rebranding. This was coordinated, and I want to represent you. I'm a retired shop teacher living in a rented cabin. I can't pay an IP attorney. My father made rocking chairs for 40 years, Ruth said. A dealer in Portland bought 6 of them, sanded off his maker's marks, and resold them as imports at triple the price. My father couldn't afford a lawyer either. I became one so the next craftsman could. She laid out her approach in under a minute. Federal Court for Intellectual Property Theft, New York State Court for Commercial Fraud. The divorce settlement reopened for judicial review. $12,000 declared on furniture worth more than $300,000. Dual filings in 2 jurisdictions, blocking any procedural escape. I build cases the way my father built chairs, she said. Every joint tight. Nothing left to chance. I sat in the dark with the phone against my ear and the engine cooling under the hood. A woman whose father's marks had been sanded off other people's wood, calling at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night because mine had survived. When do we start? I asked. We already have. Ruth filed the federal complaint on a Monday. Southern District of New York. Intellectual property theft, misappropriation of creative works, fraudulent attribution of authorship. 47 pages. That afternoon, she filed a second action in New York State Supreme Court. Commercial fraud, unjust enrichment, conspiracy to misrepresent the origin of goods offered for sale. 2 courts, 2 dockets, 2 judges. Drake's legal team would have to defend both at the same time, in 2 different jurisdictions, under 2 different bodies of law. He can't settle one and dodge the other, Ruth said when she called that evening. Federal handles the IP theft. State handles the fraud. If he runs from one, the other closes. I was in the garage workshop running a hand plane along a butternut board. The curl came off in a single ribbon. What do you need from me? Everything in sworn affidavit form. The journal, the receipts, the supplier confirmations. And I need you for a deposition in 2 weeks. I'll be there. The case stood on 3 legs. First, the compass rose marks, 43 pieces, each branded in a hidden location. Phoebe had documented 12 at the gala. Ruth subpoenaed access to the remaining pieces in Drake's studio and a storage facility in Long Island City. Drake's attorney tried for a 30-day delay. The judge gave him 48 hours. Ruth's forensic examiner went piece by piece through the studio, the warehouse rows, the staging area where Sorrento Living filmed its set pieces. She found the mark on everyone. 43 out of 43. Second, the craft journal. 28 years of dated entries, sketches, wood species, joinery notes, photographs of finished work. The earliest pages predated Drake's design career by more than a decade. In 1998, when I was filling that journal with my first dovetail drawings, Drake was, as Phoebe's research confirmed, a second-year student at Parsons who hadn't built a chair or a table or a shelf. Third, Bryce's production contract with Sorrento Media, LLC, 12 pages, signed 4 months before the divorce was final. The appendix clause granting Drake access to and use of all furnishings made available through the Frayne household. Ruth called it the smoking gun. The contract proved the furniture wasn't divided in a divorce. It was targeted, contracted for, and removed as a business operation while the marriage was still dissolving around it. Ruth filed a separate motion to reopen the divorce settlement, 43 pieces valued at $12,000 by Lorraine's attorney. Ruth's preliminary appraisal put the number above $300,000. The $12,000 figure did the same thing as Drake's brass placards, she said. Erase the maker, keep the work. That's not an oversight. That's fraud upon the court. The collapse came faster than either of us expected. 3 days after Ruth's filings hit the public docket, the streaming platform pulled Sorrento Living. Mid-season, 8 episodes aired, 4 unfinished. Phoebe called that evening. Gone overnight, she said. Every episode, every preview, every clip, wiped from the platform like it never existed. What did they say? Single paragraph about the integrity of creative partnerships. Drake's name didn't appear. That same week, the American Design Council rescinded both of Drake's industry awards. I found it on their website. 2 plaques removed, 2 acceptance speeches pulled from the video archive. The awards had recognized original contributions to American furniture design. 43 compass rose marks made the word original impossible to defend. Pre-orders for the Sorrento collection collapsed within 10 days. Ruth called with the numbers. $1.8 million in buyer commitments. Every single one withdrawn. The retailers pulled the line from catalogs overnight. and the Vietnamese factory that tooled up for production filed its own breach claim against Sorrento Media. His supply chain is suing him. She paused. He built a brand around furniture he didn't make, and now every piece of that brand is caving inward. Drake's furniture empire lasted 11 days between the gala announcement and its cancellation. I've waited longer for a finish to cure. The press covered the case for weeks. Every outlet ran the same image: Drake's $12,000 vintage chisels in their glass display case, untouched, handles still wrapped in the auction house's felt. The photograph became shorthand for the whole story. A man who kept tools he couldn't use, brought down by a man who built with tools from estate sales. $9 chisels from a Duluth garage against $12,000 collector's pieces from a Manhattan auction house. Phoebe's article had given the public the documentation. The chisel photograph gave them the symbol: Drake Sorrento, the designer who kept his tools behind glass. I followed the coverage from the workshop while building a nightstand from cherry. Not satisfaction, not anger. The way you watch a stressed joint give under load. The failure was built into the structure from the start. It just needed weight. Lorraine's world came apart on a different schedule. Karen Henderson, the college friend whose living room renovation had brought Drake into our lives, unfollowed Lorraine within 48 hours of the article. The Seagulls, the Walshes, the garden party circles where Lorraine had introduced me with that tight smile and the pause after high school, none of them took her calls. Ruth's paralegal, a woman named Gina Ferreira, compiled the timeline from social media and phone records obtained through discovery. 19 unreturned calls in a single week. 19 attempts to reach women who'd lent her the feeling of belonging to a life she never owned. Her Pinterest board, The Life, went private. 9 years. 4,000 pins. Hidden behind a toggle when the life she'd chosen made national news. I didn't take pleasure in it. I'd watched her build that board for years without her knowing. A woman assembling a future one-saved image at a time. Bryce's 40,000 followers turned with the speed they'd been built on. Someone started pulling apart 3 years of his Instagram posts. Behind-the-scenes clips from Sorrento Living. 10-second videos shot on his phone in Drake's studio, the staging area, the production floor. In 7 separate clips, my furniture appeared in frame. In 3 of those clips, the compass rose was visible, a drawer left open behind a lighting rig, a chair tilted during a set change, a cabinet filmed from a low angle that caught the mark on the rear panel. My son had filmed my brand with his own phone and posted it to his own account without knowing what he was looking at. The boy who used to press his nose against cherry boards couldn't identify his father's mark burned into the same wood. The screenshots spread across forums and news aggregators, each tagged with Bryce's username. The marks circled in red. 40,000 followers became 40,000 witnesses. His count dropped by half in a week. The comments were worse than the unfollows. Someone screenshotted the contract's appendix clause and posted it under every video he'd ever uploaded. Drake's attorneys requested a settlement conference in January. Ruth and I sat in her Burlington office, second floor of a converted mill building, the windows edged with frost. A drafting table she'd inherited from her father served as the conference surface, its top scarred and ring-stained from decades of use. Drake's team appeared on a video screen, 2 partners from a Manhattan firm, matching dark suits, expressions arranged to project concern without admitting fault. Their lead spoke first. My client is prepared to discuss a resolution that addresses Mr. Frayne's concerns while avoiding the expense and disruption of trial. Ruth set a single sheet on the drafting table: full restitution for the intellectual property theft, disgorgement of all profits from the collection launch, sponsorships and licensing agreements, a public statement of attribution, a consent decree barring any future use of Mr. Frayne's designs or marks. The figure your client is proposing, 7 figures, Ruth said. The federal case is calendared for March. State fraud runs in parallel. The Manhattan DA's office has expressed interest in criminal prosecution. Fraud carries prison time in New York. My client disputes the valuation methodology. Your client put brass placards on another man's work. The methodology is the least of his problems. The second attorney leaned toward his colleague. A whispered exchange off mic. The lead turned back to the camera. We'll need to confer with our client. Take the weekend, Ruth said. Monday, I file for expedited discovery on Drake's personal finances. The screen went black. Ruth closed her laptop and looked at me across her father's drafting table. He'll settle, she said. The evidence is in the wood. He can't argue 43 marks got there by accident. Drake signed the settlement agreement in February. 7 figures. His attorneys negotiated a confidentiality clause on the amount, and Ruth agreed. The money was never the point. The public statement went out the same afternoon. 4 paragraphs acknowledging that the furniture marketed as the Sorrento collection was the original work of Abel Frayne, built by hand over 28 years in a Minneapolis basement workshop. My name on a document his own hand signed. Bryce's production contract was voided by consent. Associate producer credit stripped from 8 episodes. The settlement clawed his salary back to the signing date. Ruth had the appendix clause, access to and use of all furnishings made available through the Frayne household, struck from the record. The Minnesota court accepted Ruth's motion to reopen the divorce settlement. Claire Dufresne, a forensic appraiser who specialized in artisan furniture valuation, examined the pieces impounded under court order from Drake's storage. Her report valued the collection at $327,000. The original settlement had listed 12. Judge Margaret Yoon read the original agreement, the forensic appraisal, and the production contract with its appendix clause. She scheduled an evidentiary hearing for March. Lorraine's attorney filed an objection within the week. 14 pages of procedural argument and not one mention of the compass rose. That evening, I stood in the workshop doorway with the phone against my ear. Ruth was walking through the hearing timeline. The documentation speaks for itself, she said. Every mark, every sketch, every receipt. They wrote $12,000 on $300,000 worth of work and counted on nobody looking twice. I didn't look twice, I said. That's on me. You were grieving. Deborah Keene knew what she was doing. Tom Phelps didn't. That gap is where the fraud lived. After we hung up, I went back to the bench. The cherry nightstand sat half-finished under the overhead light, the grain running warm. I picked up the chisel, the same $9 chisel from that Duluth estate sale, bought when I was 17, its edge honed to a mirror, the handle worn to the shape of my grip over 37 years of use. I set it against the wood and pushed. A clean cut following the grain. The same motion I'd made 10,000 times before. Drake kept his chisels behind glass. $12,000 of vintage steel, untouched, each handle still wrapped in the auction house's felt. Display pieces. Objects for a shelf. Mine cost $9, and they built 43 pieces of furniture that a man with a television show and a glass case tried to claim as his own. Tools are made to be used. That was the part he never understood. Feeling connected to my revenge? Hit like and give me a score from 1 to 10. Explain in the comments. The sign went up on a Tuesday in April. Hand-painted. White letters on dark green hung from iron brackets. I forged myself at a blacksmith's shop in Putney, Emmett R. Frayne Workshop. My father's name on a building where hands did honest work. He would have understood that without me explaining it. The Minnesota court had ruled in March. Judge Yoon voided the original property valuation, called the $12,000 figure a misrepresentation of documented artisan work, and ordered full restitution. The settlement funded the workshop lease and the first lumber order. The space was a former auto repair garage on a side street off Main in Brattleboro. 1,200 square feet, north-facing windows, concrete floor, a roll-up door wide enough to move a dining table through without tilting it. The landlord was a retired mechanic named Carl Briggs who'd run the place for 30 years before his knees gave out. He watched me move in the workbenches and the hand tools and the rebuilt 1963 lathe. "What do you make?" he asked. "Furniture. Any good?" "Been doing it 37 years. Getting closer." He laughed and gave me a month free on the lease. The first commission came through Phoebe's article. First piece I'd ever build for someone else's home. Took me a week to send the quote. A couple in Montpelier wanted a dining table in black walnut, 8 feet, seating for 10. I quoted them a price that reflected the wood, the hours, and the 37 years it took to learn how to do it right. They didn't negotiate. After the table, the calls kept coming. A lawyer in Boston wanted Windsor chairs. An architect in Portland ordered a credenza in white oak. A woman in Chicago sent photographs of her grandmother's blanket chest, fallen apart, the joints blown, the lid warped, and asked if I could build her a new one from cherry. I told her cherry was the right wood for a chest meant to hold something worth keeping. The lid would smell like the wood for years. Someone would notice that. She wired the deposit that afternoon. Each piece left the shop carrying the compass rose on its underside. Same branding iron, same 4 points, same initials at center. I burned the mark where a hand would find it the first time someone flipped the piece over. Centered, clean, placed with intent. No one would have to know where to look. The mark sat where any hand would find it. Phoebe mailed me a framed copy of the article. I hung it near the front door, the only thing on the walls that wasn't a tool or a piece of lumber. The Craftsman's Ghost. 7,000 words and a split-frame photograph of my journal sketch next to Drake's brass placard. Visitors read it sometimes. Most didn't. The article told one story. The workshop told another. Bryce hadn't called. I left the number where it was. Mornings, I unlocked the roll-up door and let the air in. Sugar maple drying on the racks. Butternut stacked with spacers. White ash waiting its turn. I picked up a board, ran my thumb along the grain, and listened for where it wanted the plane to go. A nuthatch worked the bark of the oak outside the north window. I watched it for 10 seconds, then turned back to the bench. I'd sketch it later, in the margin of the journal, next to whatever I was building that day. The compass rose sat on the shelf above the workbench. Cold steel, 4 points worn smooth, ready when I was.